Hello everyone, and welcome to our channel, Secrets in the Shadows, where we uncover the most chilling and mysterious true crime stories. Today, we're diving deep into the heartbreaking case of Fusako Sano, a young girl who was abducted and kept captive for over 9 years in a small room. Before we begin, I must warn you, this story contains details of abuse and captivity that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. If you appreciate thoughtful, in-depth true crime content, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you won't miss any of our uploads. Let's get started. On November 13th, 1990 in Sanjo, a quiet town in Niigata Prefecture, Japan. This is where 9-year-old Fusako Sano lived with her family. Fusako was just like any other little girl, full of life, curiosity, and innocence. That day, Fusako left school like she always did, walking the short route home. But she never made it. Somewhere along the way, she vanished without a trace. Her family and neighbors were devastated and launched a massive search. Despite their efforts, Fusako seemed to have disappeared into thin air. What no one could have imagined was that Fusako was taken by a man who would hold her captive for nearly a decade. Imagine being taken from everything you know and locked in a tiny, dirty room. That's what happened to Fusako. She was abducted by a man named Nobuyuki Sato and forced to live in a small, cluttered room in his home. The room was about the size of a small bedroom, but it wasn't a comfortable space. It was filled with trash. There was no heating in the winter and no air conditioning in the summer. The conditions were harsh. She wasn't even allowed to open the windows or look outside. Fusako spent every single day of her captivity in that same room. For 9 years, her world was nothing but those 4 walls. Sato didn't just lock Fusako away. He controlled her life with fear. He often yelled at her and threatened her, making her too scared to even think about escaping. He told her terrible things would happen if she disobeyed him. This constant fear broke her spirit over time. She was just a child when she was taken, and being so young, she didn't know how to fight back or resist. Instead, she became numb, trying to survive day by day. Can you imagine living like that? Afraid every single moment, not knowing if you'll ever be free again? Living in that room wasn't just hard emotionally, it was hard on her body too. Fusako wasn't fed properly. Sato would give her small amounts of food, but it was never enough or healthy. Over time, she became malnourished and very weak. She also couldn't clean herself properly. Sato rarely let her bathe, and there was no proper bathroom in the room. She had to live in dirty and unhygienic conditions. This lack of care made her sickly and frail. For 9 years, her body suffered as much as her mind did. One of the hardest things Fusako endured was being completely cut off from the outside world. She never saw her family, never spoke to anyone else, and never felt the warmth of sunlight. Her only connection to the world outside was a small radio. She would listen to news and events, like the Great Hanshin earthquake and the death of Princess Diana. But hearing these things only reminded her of the life she had lost. Being isolated for so long can change a person's mind. Fusako became quiet, withdrawn, and numb. She stopped hoping for escape because it seemed impossible. Living in such terrible conditions for so long deeply affected Fusako's mind. She developed something called trauma bonding, which happens when a victim starts to depend on their abuser to survive. Even though Sato was cruel to her, she felt trapped and unable to fight back because she feared him so much. She also likely experienced severe PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This includes things like flashbacks, nightmares, and being constantly on edge. After so many years of abuse, Fusako had forgotten what it felt like to be safe or happy. When she was finally rescued, she barely spoke. Her emotions seemed flat, and she had a hard time expressing how she felt. This was her way of protecting herself from all the pain. So, How did Fusako survive such a nightmare? In a way, she learned to adapt. She didn't fight or try to escape because she knew it wouldn't work. Instead, she stayed quiet and followed Sato's rules to avoid angering him. Her radio became her lifeline. Even though it couldn't help her escape, it gave her something to focus on, a way to distract herself from the horror of her situation. This mental adaptation, shutting down emotions and going through the motions, was how she stayed alive. After 9 long years, Fusako was finally rescued in January 2000. Police raided Sato's house after his family became concerned about his behavior. When they entered that small, dirty room, they found Fusako, a frail, malnourished young woman who had spent nearly a decade in captivity. She was immediately taken to the hospital, where doctors found that her body had suffered from years of neglect. But even more than her body, her mind had endured unimaginable trauma. Rebuilding her life wasn't easy for Fusako. After so many years of isolation, she found it hard to adjust to the outside world. Everyday things like talking to people or walking outside felt overwhelming. She needed therapy and support to help her heal from the trauma. Her family was there for her, but even with their love, it took years for her to start feeling normal again. Fusako's case also shocked Japan. People couldn't believe something so horrible had happened right in their community. Her story led to calls for better mental health care and more attention to missing person cases. Rebuilding her life wasn't easy for Fusako. After so many years of isolation, she found it hard to adjust to the outside world. Everyday things like talking to people or walking outside felt overwhelming. She needed therapy and support to help her heal from the trauma. Her family was there for her, but even with their love, it took years for her to start feeling normal again. Fusako's case also shocked Japan. People couldn't believe something so horrible had happened right in their community. Her story led to calls for better mental health care and more attention to missing person cases. One of the most baffling parts of this case is that Sato's parents lived in the same house. How could they not know? Sato's parents were elderly and reportedly afraid of him. He was known to be violent and aggressive, even towards them. Over the years, his erratic behavior made them avoid conflict with him. Sato convinced them that the noises coming from his room were just his television or radio. When they questioned him, he would yell or lash out, making them back off. They learned not to interfere with what he was doing. In truth, Sato's parents may have suspected something was wrong, but were too scared of their son to investigate further. Sato was a loner. He rarely interacted with anyone outside his home, which made it easier to keep Fusako hidden. He had no job, no social circle, and no visitors. His life revolved around controlling Fusako and listening to the radio or watching television. His reclusive nature allowed him to keep his horrifying secret. Neighbors later reported that Sato had always been a bit odd, but no one thought he was capable of such a crime. He blended into the background, avoiding attention. In hindsight, there were some warning signs. For instance, neighbors sometimes heard unusual sounds coming from Sato's home, but they dismissed them as everyday noise. In Japanese culture, privacy and respecting personal space are deeply valued. This cultural norm likely contributed to why no one questioned what was happening inside the house. People assumed that whatever went on there was none of their business. To understand why Sato committed such a horrific act, we have to look at his mental state. Sato was a deeply troubled man. Reports suggest he had severe psychological issues, including paranoia and delusional thinking. He was obsessed with control and dominance, which likely fueled his decision to abduct Fusako. He had a volatile temper and was prone to outbursts of anger. These traits made him a terrifying figure to those around him, including his parents. Some experts believe Sato's behavior was a result of untreated mental illness. His isolation, lack of social interaction, and inability to form healthy relationships likely worsened his condition over time. Sato's relationship with his parents was strained and dysfunctional. He lived with them well into adulthood, but instead of contributing to the household, he created an environment of fear. He was verbally and physically abusive, which made his parents feel powerless. They had little control over him and likely felt ashamed or embarrassed about his behavior. In traditional Japanese households, maintaining appearances is important, so his parents may have chosen to suffer in silence rather than seek help or involve authorities. This toxic dynamic allowed Saito to dominate the household, giving him the freedom to hide Fusako without interference. In the end, it was Sato's erratic behavior that led to his downfall. His parents finally contacted the police because they couldn't handle his aggression anymore. When officers arrived, they discovered Fusako in the small, dirty room where she had spent nearly a decade of her life. Sato was arrested, and his horrifying secret was finally exposed to the world. Nobuyuki Sato was sentenced to 9 years in prison for the abduction and prolonged captivity of Fusako Sano. During his trial, his legal team argued that he suffered from mental health issues, but this claim was dismissed, and he was held fully accountable for his actions. His crime deeply shocked Japan and raised questions about how such a case could have remained undiscovered for so long. After serving his sentence, Sato lived a reclusive life. He passed away in 2017 at the age of 53. The exact cause of his death was never determined, but it brought an end to the life of a man whose actions left lasting scars on Fusako and her family. Fusako Sano's story is heartbreaking. She endured years of torment and isolation, but she survived. Her strength and resilience remind us how important it is to protect the most vulnerable among us. If you found this story moving or eye-opening, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay safe and take care of yourself. Look out for one another. We'll see you in the next video.